This is the Nobel Podcast, where we talk about how to optimize your technology, life, and mind. We're joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others who have overcome difficulty to make it to the top of their craft by staying in the fight. I'm Sam Alaimo. Welcome to the Nobel Podcast. I have Bruce Gudmundsson with me, military veteran, Marine Corps veteran, military historian. You've authored many books, Stormtroop Tactics, on infantry, on artillery, the British Army on the Western Front, and many others. Very excited to have you. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Let's start from the very beginning. Where did you grow up?
This may take up the entire podcast. I had a very interesting childhood, a lovely childhood, a very fine childhood. So my parents met at the UN, at the United Nations, in the 1950s, when it was a very different place than it is now. A much happier place, I'm sorry to say. My mother came from the smallest town in the Canadian province of Manitoba, Waskata, Manitoba, about 3 miles from the North Dakota border. So very small town.
How many people?
Her father was a wheat farmer. And my father came from Iceland. He came from downtown Reykjavik, where his father worked on the docks in the harbor in Reykjavik. And in those days, he was born in 1912. Reykjavik was little more than the harbor. It was basically a fishing village. It wasn't the refuge for the tragically hip it is now. It has since become very, very different world. So I was born in Copenhagen, in the hospital where Søren Kierkegaard died, if you like philosophy. And then my first memories actually come from Pakistan. So when I was 2.5, my family moved to Pakistan and to Karachi. This is before Islamabad had been built, or Islamabad was being built at the time, this is early 60s. And that was a wonderful experience in many, many respects. It gave me a sense for the much wider world. It gave me a sense of my good fortune, how lucky I was. Regular encounters with lepers will do that to you. It was very much almost a 1001 Arabian Nights experience with snake charmers and camels and horse racing on the beach, and actually going down to the beach on a rope, right, to get to the beach, and seeing women walking with water jugs on their heads. A very wonderful education, I think, for a small child. Gave me a taste for Kipling. Gave me an ear. I don't speak Hindustani or Urdu or Hindi, but it gave me an ear for the language so that I can watch a Bollywood movie and figure out what's going on between the song and dance numbers. That's a useful skill. And then moved back to Copenhagen. And that was also an education going from the third world to the first. Much more Scandinavian place than it is now. Scandinavia was much less English or Americanized than it is now. But it was a childhood full of Lego. My father spoke the Danish language very, very well. He had a wonderful job, perhaps the easiest job in the world, selling the UN to Scandinavians, right? He was a public affairs officer. Both my parents were in the public affairs business. And then at the age of 8, we moved to Yonkers, New York, in the Hudson Valley. My dad worked at the UN headquarters. That was not a happy time for him because the UN had already become, well, I won't mince words, it had become corrupt. And that broke his heart. It was very hard for him. But he soldiered through, mostly at that point to get the pension, take care of the family. In 1967, we drove up the Hudson Valley through the Adirondacks up to Montreal for Expo 67. And that was a wonderful education because it gave me my passion for the War of Independence, for the French and Indian Wars, for American history, for the 18th century. So that really shaped me in a big way. Actually, an experience very similar to, I think, Mark McGrath's experience. Moose is a friend of mine, and I really enjoyed your interview of him on this podcast. And so it was an Italian neighborhood next to a Polish neighborhood, next to a Russian neighborhood. But I went to a Lutheran parochial school, which was run by the people, I say with all affection, were refugees from a Garrison Keillor monologue. Right? So it was like a little bit of the Midwest, 18 miles from Times Square. And the contrast between that and my previous experiences, and also being in the orbit of New York City, created, I think, a great deal of creative creative tension, for which I'm very grateful. So I spent summers in Iceland, some summers, every second summer in Iceland, working on the language, which I've yet to master. Again, gave me a taste for the variety of the wider world. I worked at a farm. I know one of your guests talked about shoveling manure. I cleaned out this very large manure pit underneath a stable for some prize bulls. It was a very, very good experience. Painted a lot of farm machinery, raked a lot of hay, and this is actually an interesting farm. It was, if you've ever read Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Yeah, Jules.
The farm was in the shadow of that mountain where they started their journey. I spent a summer in the Icelandic Coast Guard, which was an interesting, not really a military experience. For one thing, we were unionized. So the bosun of the ship was also the shop steward. The enlistments were for 2 weeks at a time. Mostly I swabbed decks, but that was also a very good experience. When I speak Icelandic, I can discuss farm matters and nautical matters, but not much else. Though one of the many gifts my father gave me was the gift of Icelandic poetry. So we were both early risers, and before the rest of the family awoke, we would have breakfast together and recite Viking poetry. So, það mælti mín móðir mér skyldi kaupa fley og fagravrar. That's a 10th century poem.
What is that in English?
That's, my mother told me that there should be bought for me a ship with beautiful oars.
There we go. Good Viking.
Yeah.
Nice.
Right. Actually, that poem has been turned into song by a number of people on YouTube, and I think featured. I haven't seen the History Channel Vikings show, but I think it features there. But it's actually a 12-year-old boy trying to encapsulate the Viking spirit. The last line is sail into harbors, hew men, as in hewing with an axe, and others, right? So it's
That gets me amped up in a good way. I like it.
Yeah, so that was a big part of my education, and then I joined the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine Corps Reserve.
What was the earliest memory you have of the Marine Corps? Was it Pakistan? Was it Copenhagen? Was it Yonkers? Where was it?
Yeah. Okay. So in Pakistan, we had in our household a bearer, and again, if you go back to Kipling, in the days of the Raj in India, the British rule in India, which was then only barely over. This was the early 60s, so that ends in 1947. So still the shadow of that world was. I went to the shadow. It was still very much part of our reality. So the bearer in our household was a Pathan, as they said, a Pushtun. He was Sikandar, from the hills, and this great big hennaed mustache. And he had been a sergeant in the old Indian Army, the pre-47 Indian Army. I later learned that he joined the army because he was fleeing from a blood feud, which, a common thing in the mountains. So he went down to the plains and took service with the King Emperor. And he would drill me and my older brother, who also became a Marine, before our porridge in the morning. So that's certainly part of the experience, is, being a little close order drill at the age of 4 or 5 or 6. And all with wonderful tenderness and care, and, all appropriate to childhood. Then in Copenhagen, we had the Royal Guards, the ones who marched through Tivoli Garden. That was, I think, an example of a different kind of military experience. We always enjoyed that. And then coming to the U.S., really in the middle of the Vietnam War, and seeing, I was, greatly distressed by what happened in the Vietnam War. I was ashamed of the older boys who would spend a lot of time planning their ways to avoid service. I read a great deal about the war, became convinced that it was a noble war, that our loss of that war set all sorts of bad things in motion. Of course, the people who suffered the most from it were the Vietnamese people. That had a huge effect on me. And I was convinced that there were I saw a couple of big problems. One was that our military leadership was not doing what it should have done. It was a badly handled war from a military point of view. And the other one was that the whole question of how do we get people involved with the armed forces in a healthy way. I was convinced that I was an American, right? I'd lived in America for 10 years and saw myself as really entirely American, and more than everyone else saw me as American. Funny incident when I was going to the courthouse to get my final citizenship. My sponsor was an American of Japanese descent, and everyone thought that I was the sponsor and he was the fledgling citizen.
That's America.
Yeah. So doing the most American thing I could think of, joining the Marine Corps was part of it. I joined the reserve rather than the active force, largely because it was very important to my father that I go to university. And I was the first person in my family, my line, to go to university since as far as we can tell, the 13th century.
Well done.
Yeah, there was a fellow back in the 13th century who went to the Sorbonne, according to the legend.
What year did you enlist?
Enlisted in 1977.
So just after the war. Okay.
Just
so
after.
You weren't going to be sent over.
Yeah. So again, joined the Marine Corps Reserve, went through basic training, which was a wonderful experience. It was that had been squared away by then. Very, very encouraging experience. And I felt that I was in the right place. Gone back to the 13-week recruit training, which I think is a very good thing. And, at week 11 or so, there is a sense of cohesion in the platoon, almost supernatural, that sense of connection.
So 1977, was there any sort of aspersion cast on you for wanting to join the military, and then of the military, the Marine Corps, given the nature of the protests at the time against the war? There was a lot of backlash against the military, which historically everyone knows is kind of unjust. Was there any aspersion cast on you for doing that?
I think my high school teachers thought I was nuts, or worse. My father didn't understand it. He had no military tradition in the family. I mean, again, for 500 years. My mother understood it. And she was, again, from Western Canada, which, if you look at the history of the world wars, I think sent a higher proportion of its young men into battle than any part of the British Empire except for Rhodesia.
I didn't know that. It's awesome.
Yeah. And you have to look carefully at the numbers because, of course, Canada is a big place. But Western Canada in particular, she was of Scots-Irish ethnicity. And if you've looked into that, if you read, what was the book, Born Fighting, book worth looking into, their book called People Without a Name. But if you look into the history of the Scots-Irish, particularly, in America, you'll see a certain bellicosity there. So she was, I know this is strange. Usually it's the dad who's more supportive than the mom. And again, my mother had, 3 sons, all 3 became Marines. And to her dying day, wore the Eagle Globe and Anchor, on a chain. So very, very proud of that. Then after basic training, went to Camp Lejeune, which was, Camp Lejeune in 1977 was a very depressing place. And I think we were still getting rid of all the wrong people we had brought in the 70s. And so that was a very depressing experience, and it made me commit really myself to military reform, to finding better ways of doing things.
So you saw a military that was racked from a long war, very high death count, very even higher wounded count, who drafted people who in no way, shape, or form wanted to be there. And that's when you showed up. You showed up to an institution that was like hurting from the inside out. I guess that you said that started your idea, your passion for military reform. How did that shape, I guess, the rest of your 20-year career?
I'll go back a little bit. I think in 1977, the problem was less Vietnam per se than the first 4 years of the all-volunteer force. So, in fact, the Vietnam vets, like my senior drill instructor, Staff Sergeant Beck, I still remember him fondly and distinctly. He was a Vietnam veteran. The other 3 drill instructors weren't, because the Marine Corps really leaves Vietnam in 1970 in a big way. There are other things, going on, but the bulk of the Marine Corps leaves in 1970. So we were, 7 years away from the Vietnam War, 4 years away from the draft. So the real problem was the personnel policy. It's just the lack of quality control. My subsequent commitment, and I didn't really have on paper, a 20-year reserve career, but I was in and out several times. So I had that initial period of active duty, went to college, then after college, went to OCS, served for 4 years as an officer in the fleet, in the logistics field. They found out in college I'd worked as a forklift operator in a warehouse in New York. And that was a great experience too. And then I left. And then in 89, I went back on active duty. And I'd spent some time in the 25th Marines in the Reserve Battalion in New England, but went back in active duty and got the wonderful job of designing what I call the Gifted and Talented program for the Staff College. This was the School of Advanced Warfighting. And this is very much part of the Al Gray maneuver warfare movement. And I was part of that and had written a book that had just come out before then. And the General Gray apparently read the book and said, I want that boy running one of my schools. So at the age of 29, with a bachelor's degree, I got to design a graduate school. And I had a blank piece. It was an incredible opportunity, a blank sheet of paper. I designed that, taught there for a couple of years. When General Gray left, there was a backlash against the maneuver warfare movement, against anything that had been touched by General Gray. I left active duty. It was actually my last active duty was ended in 92, but continued to live in Quantico, continued to do a lot of work for the Marine Corps, and again, sort of living on the margins between the Marine Corps and the world of military history and of writing for publication.
So if you look back 20 years, 8 active, 12 reserve, what on the one hand would be the best aspects of the military, and then on the other hand, the worst aspects you came across?
The people and the people. I've just met some remarkable people, remarkable in all sorts of ways. It really is people from all walks of life, very often very interesting people with interests of all sorts of interests. I know in the 25th Marines, my platoon sergeant was a surrealist artist, right? He was a painter. If Dave Kenny, if you're out there, I'd love to hear from you. And at the same time, there were some real bozos, people I would now, again, I'm not that kind of doctor, but classify as narcissists. And this I think is one of the problems an inherent problem with the way we reward people in the service and the way we ask people to manage their own careers, is that it's something that's very well suited to a narcissist. Right?
Can you dig in on that one, please? Define what you mean narcissist in this case.
Okay.
And give some concrete examples. I'm very curious.
Yeah. So a narcissist is a person who constantly needs to be reminded that he's not just okay, but better than okay. Right. So he needs this thing that the psychologists call narcissistic supply. And anytime that sense is threatened, he will lash out and punish people. And his main motivation in life is getting that narcissistic supply. So I know of one case. This was a commanding officer, what was then called a landing support battalion, which is almost like the old World War II pioneer units. And the idea is that you don't land with the first wave, but you land with the second wave and set up the beach. And also do a lot of work with helicopter support teams and running ports and things like that. And this is actually a very easy battalion to run, because it basically is a home for detachments. You just send out detachments and come back. So, and this one battalion commander was constantly in need of praise, reassurance. His welcome aboard speech was a 2-hour account of how wonderful he was. I was hoping to find out, tell me about this battalion, its mission, where we are, what are we trying to do, what our challenges are. But it was all about him. And that made life very, very difficult, because I basically spent my time trying to reduce doing damage control, reduce the damage he was doing. That was a very unpleasant experience. And I've seen that not so closely, but you see that often with general officers in particular. It's clear they're in it for this supply, this kind of reassurance. And that, of course, makes it very hard to get anything useful done. it paralyzes them in terms of doing the right things, but it means their subordinates, in order to get anything done, have to master the art of sycophancy, right? They have to, learn how to be courtiers. And that's something I also observed. And I guess this is, as a brand new lieutenant, I had a little bit of experience, I did 4 years in the reserve, but still, very, very young, and seeing all these, captains and majors, spending their time, polishing apples.
What about best and worst day in the military?
So many good days. So many good days. Actually, I remember an exercise up in Pickle Meadows, the Mountain Warfare Training Center. I was the executive officer of the weapons company of the 25th Marines, and the commanding officer later became a congressman. I say that without admiration. And we'd been hiking up a mountain, and halfway up through the hike, somebody slipped, and he said, "Oh, I need to take care of my Marine." Jumped on the truck and disappeared, right? And so I was in command, and I had to organize a raid. And I pulled something out of the First World War, adapted it, gave the order right there, and we had our raid. And we had a journalist there from the Sacramento Bee who was able to record that. And the troops had a great experience, and I did too, because enjoying the thrill of improvising on the spot, but at the same time being able to put my historical work to use. It was very practical. I don't know if this would have worked in practice, but at least I had I had the plan in my mind and could adapt it to the terrain and explain it.
Let's roll then into some of your professional work. I think that's a great pivot. Some of the work you've done, I forget which piece it was, but you talked about the strike of the eye and supposing. I think it was the education of the enlightened soldier.
Yes, yeah.
And that's pretty much what you're talking about. It sounds like your mind was churning in real time, observing the environment, strike of the eye, and then supposing what would happen if X occurred or Y occurred or Z occurred. And in the military, I was taught 3 questions. What's the condition of my weapon? What would I do if I were contacted right now? How can I best support my buddy? That, when I thought about it, that's more of like a ground pounder. I'm on the ground holding a rifle. My job is to execute. What you're talking about seems to be more elevated, more of an officer position. Can you talk about the strike of the eye and the supposing, the theory behind it and how it applies?
Yeah. This is something that develops in the 18th century, the theory of it, because it's 18th century. The word is French, coup d'œil, right? Literally strike of the eye, being hit by the eye, and it's interesting that we think of eyes as being passive rather than active, but this clearly is the eye that's doing the punching, right? The same word as punch in French. So initially, it was used by engineers, military engineers, who were trying to make sense of a piece of terrain. How do we defend it? How can we attack it? How can we fortify it? So it starts off being slow. And then somebody in the 18th century, may have been Frederick the Great, but he may have got it from somebody else. I haven't traced it all the way back. Said, no, we're doing this quickly. This isn't about the engineer with his paper and his pencil drawing, the perfect plan. This is about somebody looking at the terrain and making an instant evaluation of it. What's really important here? And Napoleon makes a big deal of this. And of course, his great stock in trade was speed. And you can only march so fast, you can only ride so fast, but you can think quickly. And that was what he was doing. And then the folks who organized themselves to fight against him said, we can't make one Napoleon, but we can make lots of little Napoleons. Lots of guys who are doing this. And that one of them is Scharnhorst, the enlightened soldier. And there's a biography in progress. First volume is out by Charles Edward White. He rewrote a book years ago called The Enlightened Soldier. That was a big inspiration for the maneuver warfare movement in the late 80s and early 90s. That was really just a small chunk of his life. He's now working on a big biography. And I was happy to contribute to that with that little article called The Education of the Enlightened Soldier.
Oh, it's great. And then did they talk about how to actually apply that, how to learn it, how to apply it, how to make it habitual? Did they have recommendations, or did they kind of stop, hey, here's the theory, here's how it transitions into reality? or did they give recommendations for the young officer, the young leader to actually execute it?
The story about when Scharnhorst moves from being an engineer and artillery officer, finds himself in the cavalry, and the colonel will take him out for a ride, say, okay, see that village, imagine that, it is occupied by so many troops. You have these reports, what do you do? And he'd say, oh, Colonel, happy to tell you, I'll get back to you in a week. Right? I'll get, I'll sit down with a paper and a pen, and I'll make you a plan. And the colonel says, oh, no, tell me now. And there's this letter he writes back to his uncle and saying, this is something that I tried to use the methods I was taught at this engineering school. It's a remarkable school, by the way, called imagine as a military Hogwarts. So he had been taught to think slowly and think deliberately, and had this brilliant education in that. And then he's told, okay, do it much more quickly. And he develops this method, which we now call the TDG, the tactical decision game, where you set up a situation and you say, okay, what's going on here? And what do you do? What are your orders? You've got 5 minutes. So it's the time pressure that makes the difference. And it's interesting, when he is in a position to mentor young Karl von Clausewitz, he says, I want you to teach 2 things. I want you to teach artillery and gunnery with mathematics and all that deliberate, slow thinking stuff. And I also want you to teach small wars. I want you to teach guerrilla warfare. So Clausewitz is there pulling these examples very often out of the American War of Independence. He was a great student of the American War of Independence, talking about ambushes and the defense of forward positions and these small scale engagements. There's again where you don't have weeks to plan the defense. So there's this. The Scharnhorst uses that tension as the basis for not just his own work, but also the way he trains his subordinates, the most famous of whom is Karl von Clausewitz.
You're talking about the execution, but then going, I guess, upstream back in time, there's the book study, there's the general education. How necessary is that book study, general education, to battlefield mastery? Given the historical record, that used to be a major aspect. I guess it still is at the academies, but any elaboration on that? Any unique insights?
Yes, I think that you need a lot of military history, both so you can imagine the range of possibilities, the first thing. The second thing is to, I think, realize just how peculiar each situation is, so that you don't end up with trying to apply one theory over and over again. History is also about people, right? And leadership is about people. Right? It's so you learn all sorts of about personalities, and again, I don't think book learning alone will serve you, but it is interesting. And this is something that's a big shock to the armed forces, or the armies in particular, of the world in the mid-19th century, where the Prussians, and these are the people who are the linear descendants of Scharnhorst and Clausewitz, have a very academic approach to the study of war. And they're beating opponents with a lot more experience. So they beat the Austrians in 1866, and they beat the French in 1870. And that is I'll use a boomer analogy here. That's the 69 Mets, right? That's the absolute upstart. That is the big surprise, that this nation of philosophers defeats the descendants of Napoleon. And just, think about how influential the French were at that time, right? I mean, we fight our own civil war with French uniforms, French weapons, French tactics. If you read the writings, the orders very often of people, certainly at the start of the Civil War, they're half in French. It was an incredible upset, and that is what really sparks a great deal of interest in, I won't say the academic study of military matters, but the bookish study Really that the study of military history.
So probably an impossible task, but one or two books that someone listening might want to read if they want to do their own general education to, I guess you'd recommend for someone trying to do that battlefield mastery, whether it translates to actual warfare or the business environment. What are one or two good books that would help people zoom out and get that education?
Yeah. I would start with Aristotle's Politics.
Nice.
Yeah. Right. So, and I read that when I was 15. I was working at the farm in Iceland and, looking at that dead volcano in all its beauty. And the thing I pulled from Aristotle's Politics is the ability to think on two tracks. So Aristotle is saying, okay, given human nature, this is the best constitution. But we're living in Athens. Okay. And Athens has these peculiarities. So given the situation at Athens, what's the best we can hope for here in Athens? So it's that ability to think on the two tracks, that the ideal and the applied at the same time. It's not airy-fairy, he's not up in the sky like Plato often was, but at the same time, he's also not cynical. It's that constant tension. And as you can see, the next book I recommend also is based upon a tension. It's by Francis Tucker. It's called The Pattern of War. And there he's talking about the two very different kinds of war that he experienced in the world wars: the position warfare or trench warfare, and then the mobile warfare. And he was very much involved in the mobile warfare in North Africa in World War II. So getting a sense of these tensions, it's not an either or. There's a lot more and than either or.
I did not expect you to say Aristotle Politics. The Greeks called it mende on the one hand, on the other. I'm still trying to get that inside of my brain to think that way and not just make the immediate decision, but think about both sides of that coin and not cynically, which is one of my favorite aspects of Aristotle. You mentioned earlier slow thinking. So can you talk about the difference between slow thinking and fast thinking, obviously as it pertains to combat, but also let's try to pivot it to like a business environment. How do those two aspects apply?
Yeah, well, first of all, they are complementary. Right? You don't want someone to say, well, I'm always flying by the seat of my pants, or I need a week to think things through. Sometimes you have a week, sometimes you don't. So the first bit of advice I give really to anybody doing anything in life is that you have to do both. You can't be a one-trick pony, right? You have to be able to do both. And they complement each other. And very often you will make a decision in the heat of the moment. It will not be the best decision. Guarantee you that. It will not be optimal. But if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, you think again and do something else. And then you reflect upon that. You reflect upon your quick decisions and do that slowly. But then you also do all the things that build up your mental arsenal. And a big part of that is accumulating models. And you get that from reading history. And again, seeing all of these different examples, none of which will fit perfectly the situation you're in. But it is remarkable how some of the old stories prove practical. For example, buying a car. There's a story from ancient Rome about the Cumaean Sibyl. And this is early in the history of ancient Rome, when they still had the Etruscan kings. In fact, the story of, I think this was the last Etruscan king, Tarquin the Proud, right? Not Tarquin the Wise, not Tarquin the Thoughtful, but Tarquin the Proud. And there's the Sibyl, this prophetess who lives by the Tiber River. And she sits down and she writes down the future history of Rome on some wooden tablets. And she takes it to the king and says, I've got these 12 tablets with the future history of your city, and I'll sell them to you for this outrageous price. And the king says, crazy lady, go away. And she goes away and burns 3 of the tablets. Next day, she comes back with 9 tablets and offers them for the same price. And that process continues until she's got 3 tablets left, and the king pays the full price for a quarter of the prophecies. Now, what does that have to tell you about buying a car? Well, I wanted to buy a used car, and I saw one advertised, and I said, okay, I'm going to go on a Wednesday morning, because no one buys a car on a Wednesday morning. There'll be a salesman to be eager for a sale. And I saw the list price, and I got a certified check for about $2,000 less than the list price. And I said, I'd like to buy this car, please. Here's the check. And they said, oh, no, but the price is this. No, I'd like to buy the car. Here's the check. And I said, oh, yeah, but do you want financing? He said, no. Here's this certified check. And finally, I had to do a lot of convincing because they had a certain way of doing things. But I ended up, getting the price, getting the car for the price I wanted. And the car served me for a good decade. And again, I'd taken this story from the classical world and applied it to some very, very pedestrian business.
You made a caveat when you were talking about that transition from fast thinking to slow thinking, where you kind of have to make a decision and then think about it afterwards, and over time, iterate, become better. The expression I heard in the military was decision analysis paralysis, where if you had too much education without enough application, you'd be stuck in that rut, unsure what to do, and never actually make a decision. Do you have any recommendations on how to make that iterating cycle faster, from fast thinking, making a decision, knowing full well it might not be the best decision, reflecting on it, and then being faster and more accurate next time? Do you have any recommendations?
Practice with speed. Like it's like any sort of drill. You just do it quickly. You become comfortable with doing things quickly. You become comfortable with sub-optimization. And again, this is very different from, on the eve of the Vietnam War, we had the McNamara era. And the idea was that some clever people, often with the aid of computers, would be able to come up with optimal solutions. And then, we had all these military officers, rather than studying military history, going to get degrees in operations analysis to, again, make these perfect decisions in an air-conditioned room, and actually a very cold air-conditioned room because the computers generated a lot of heat in those days. And that, I think, is a big part of our defeat in Vietnam. In fact, it's remarkable how little military history was studied in the 50s and 60s. There was the sense that we had seen the end of history, that we're in the age of push-button warfare. In fact, it wasn't, I think, until the late 70s, maybe even the 80s, that military history was taught at West Point. That it was taken out of the curriculum sometime in the late 40s, early 50s, and didn't come back until, I'm thinking, either very late 70s or early 80s, by a guy named Bob Doty, who's, by the way, a terrific scholar of the French army. And a big part of this reform movement was the revival of military history, which has a number of contributors, one of which was the bicentennial, which was, I think, a very healthy thing for America, and really brought got a lot of people interested in writing military history.
I'm going to write on my whiteboard when we're done the quote, comfortable with sub-optimization, because I think that is the cure to this. There's a movement. I mean, there always has been in America, I guess, this desire to be as optimized and as perfect as possible, to gain that extra 0.1% in performance. And that is enough to cripple people to not even try in the first place. So to be able to be comfortable with sub-optimization, get out there and take a risk and iterate and become better, that is just gold. Let's talk about, a lot of our audience is in the business world, so they're very familiar with case studies, but probably not so much with decision games, and probably not decision forcing cases, especially when you add that Socratic element to it. So can you talk about the DFCs?
Yeah. So the DFCs, inspired by a number of things, one of which is the way they teach case studies at the Harvard Business School. I spent 2.5 years at the Kennedy School, right across the river from the business school. And I got that job actually through the Marine Corps Reserve. I was hired by my commanding officer in the 25th Marines. He was working at Harvard at the Kennedy School. At that time, the Kennedy School was trying to adopt the case method. So I spent a lot of time talking to professors at the business school and what have you. And so I was struck by the degree to which they ask students to do the same thing, is to make a decision and defend it, fully realizing that they don't have weeks and weeks to prepare. Now, they do spend a lot of time with the spreadsheets. When they prepare when they come to class, they often have a great deal of information, sort of information military folks are not going to have. And they're all very often able to reduce them to a bottom line, because there's no military equivalent of cash, right? So many things you can't quantify. in military matters. You're trying to do so many things at once. That's one of the inspirations. And again, the way they do it is by saying, okay, you are the CEO of Coca-Cola Company. Pepsi has introduced this, is beating you with the Pepsi challenge. This is 1986, right? What do you do? And then Coke ends up with the new Coke, which turns out to be a complete disaster. And the question is why. So a lot of business schools will make the mistake of using the case study as a springboard for the professor's ideas. So the students read the case study, the professor says, okay, let me explain this to you. The good professors at Harvard, and I'm a little worried that they're slipping on this. They just celebrated their 100th anniversary of the case method at Harvard Business School. People at Darden at Virginia are very good at this. The professor is not going to give you his opinion. He may give you some ideas at the end, but he'll basically say, okay, you're the boss, you're the decision maker. What do you do? It's really that simple. What, sir, are your orders? And when you say, let me think about it, the teacher, whoever he is, says, no, please tell me now, or tell me in 5 minutes. Maybe consult with your colleagues, but tell me very, very soon. And it's really that simple. It's just very different from the way so many other things work in life, and particularly the way that school works for many people.
I think you teach a course. If it's not a course, it's a book. I can't remember cases with Clausewitz. Do you have one or two or three like major takeaways that you could share here from that course?
Some of the cases were drawn from the War of Independence, the American War of Independence, and the textbook that Clausewitz used. There's a book by Johann Ewald called Treatise on Partisan Warfare. You can get it for free on archive.org. And these are situations, encounter battles, ambushes, things like that. So that was one part of it. And the other part is in a much higher level, Napoleon's 1814 campaign, where with inferior forces, he really manages to keep 3 very large armies away from Paris for several months. And it's really a brilliant campaign. He's dealing with very little in the way of resources and dealing with a number of actually very different enemies. So he's got Field Marshal Blücher, who is absolute madman, very aggressive. And he's got Field Marshal Schwarzenberg, who is in charge of leading the Army of Bohemia. You can imagine the Army of Bohemia. He's an Austrian. He's actually working for Napoleon's father-in-law, and he's planning on making a deal. So he's marching slowly, deliberately, not taking any risks. So the problem for Napoleon is, okay, how do I deal with these 2 very different opponents? Right? I've got this madman who takes risks, and then I have the Army of Bohemia, where they're listening to progressive jazz and drinking espresso. How do you do that? So that was the cases from Clausewitz. So I took these episodes from the writings of Clausewitz or from the cases he was using to teach, and then turned them into decision forcing cases.
Let's do kind of a lightning round. I'm going to go through some questions. We'll answer quick. What are a few things you do to prime yourself for the day? And I ask because you're in a heavily intellectual endeavor. You probably have to do a lot of deep thought. It takes a while to get in there and then stay in there. How do you prime yourself?
I prime myself before I go to sleep. So I think about what I'm going to write the next day. Get up very early. And again, I'm in my 60s, so it's easy to get up early, right? The young people like to sleep in. Young people are like nocturnal. I'm up with the chickens. I'm up well before the chickens, and then I write for 3 or 4 hours in the morning, and those are my most productive hours of the day. So and I do it, no breakfast, no coffee, just making use of the energy I accumulated while asleep. And I have a gift for sleep. This is another thing about having spent a little time in the service is that you get good at sleeping. Right? You sleep whenever you can, and I think that my subconscious mind works on the problem. It doesn't always work that way, but the words will flow like honey in August.
I've talked to a lot of writers, and a lot of them say the same thing. They'll think about it before they go to bed, wake up, put pen to paper or fingers to keypad, and just get after it. I've never been able to do it. So when you're visualizing at night, or do you set a problem and then fall asleep on the problem, or how does that work?
Yeah, usually because I'm so history based, right? That I rely on sources. I will assemble the sources.
Mm.
Put them together, in a folder on the computer. Very often, I'll do diagrams. I'll often draw before I write. So when in the afternoon and the evening, where I'm not really 100%, I do a lot of graphics work. Very often when I'm writing, I'm describing the picture.
Awesome. What about at the end of the day, pivoting away from work? Do you have any routines you abide by?
I'm not really. No. My kids are grown up. My wife likes to read, so we have our dates in the morning, sort of after I've done most of my writing, before she goes to work. And it's longer on weekends, but we sit around, have a little coffee. So that's my personal time. But I love what I do. As I said before, my father was an Icelander, and the dream of every Icelander is to make your living with your pen. So I count myself very, very fortunate. So I'm basically writing all the time. If I'm not writing, I'm preparing to write.
How do you get your best work done? How do you get in the deepest mode of focus and stay there?
Yeah, again, it's the morning. It's the morning. It doesn't always work that way. So, for example, when if I do a long drive, I'll stop after an hour and find a place where and set up and write for an hour.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
That's great.
so the two different kinds of activities complement each other. And I think I'm thinking about what I'm going to write when I'm driving, unless I'm listening to a podcast, and I love podcasts. I'm a huge fan of podcasts.
I don't usually ask this question, but like, what are one or two podcasts you recommend?
Oh, I like history podcasts. So I like David Crowther's History of England podcast. I think he's at episode 400 or something, and he's only reached, I think he's up to about 1660. He's doing a deep dive. The history of the Germans, which is still in the Middle Ages, is a little newer podcast. There is a great podcast called Thugs and Miracles about the very early kings of France. I'm talking about, before Charlemagne. If you like Dan Carlin, this is very, very much sort of like Dan Carlin light. There's one called Pax Britannica, which is also British history, but with a very broad view. So he's doing like the deep background of India before he gets to the British in India. So he's doing something, a small series in the Mughal Empire. It does some good things about the British colonies in America. History of Italy, that's a lot of fun. And again, so a lot of people are doing these, so I call them soup to nuts type podcasts. They give you the sort of the full history of a place, and they're very they're moving very, very slowly, which is just fine by me.
Movies, a couple movies that you changed your life.
Yeah, Cromwell, 1970. Richard Harris is Cromwell, and I was too young to realize the irony of an Irish actor playing Cromwell. Brilliant, brilliant movie. Sometimes takes a few liberties with the facts.
And what about books? We've talked a lot about books, but what are the books that have changed your life the most?
There was a book that came out shortly after the Vietnam War called Self-Destruction. It was written under a pseudonym, the pseudonym being Cincinnatus. And I would, if you want a sense of what happened there, I would recommend that book. That had a profound effect on me. Helped me make sense of the whole, what I was seeing at the time of the Vietnam War. The another one is The Gulag Archipelago. It's a great big book by Solzhenitsyn. Like, still can't spell Solzhenitsyn. I have to look it up every time I write it. But that was a powerful, powerful book. The third is actually, this is pretty obscure. It's by an Israeli general named Yehuda Wallach. Wallach, like the actor Eli Wallach, Wallach, Yehuda Wallach, Yehuda with a J. And it's interesting, he spells it the German way, because he's basically a German who was, sort of kicked off the team in the 30s for reasons we all know about. Went to Israel, and it's a critique of the Israeli embrace of the German methods, of the Blitzkrieg method. So this is one of the great ironies of history, is that the biggest disciples of the Germans of the 30s and 40s were the Israelis of the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. Right. So the spiritual descendant of Rommel was Moshe Dayan. It's called The Dogma of the Battle of Annihilation, and it's much more clearly written than the name suggests. Right.
That is an epic name.
Yes. Yeah. Yehuda Volek. Remarkable writer. It's a critique of two things. One, how the Germans got a lot of things right, but a lot of things wrong too, and how basically warning to the Israelis: let's not fall into the same trap. Let's imitate the virtues, but not the vices. But because he was a German speaker. In fact, most of his publications are in German. This book he wrote in English. But you can get it in German, but that's a translation from the English. It was a very good counterpart to a lot of the literature that a lot of people, including myself, put out about the German methods and the very, very adulatory literature. This will make you reflect a bit, make you think about it, realize that there are shadows as well as sunshine.
How can people follow you in your work?
Yeah, I've got a couple of Substacks. One's called The Tactical Notebook, which you'd imagine is military stuff. The other one is called Extramuros, from the Latin for outside the walls. And it's about ways people from all walks of life can get the benefits of a liberal education. So I believe very strongly that, and I'm quoting actually Ferdinand Foch here, there are no educated men, there are only men who educate themselves. Every educated person is self-educated. I don't care where you've been, and I worked at Harvard, was an undergraduate at Yale, got my PhD from Oxford. So I've been very fortunate. I've been to all these name brand schools, been around them, but that experience has convinced me that it's all self-education. And by all, I mean 100%.
That's a good way to finish it. I didn't realize I tried to boil a lifetime of thinking down to 60 minutes, but genuinely appreciate it. Couldn't be more stoked to have you on.
Well, thank you, Sam. This is an honor.
I appreciate it. That's it for this episode. If you want to check out more from the podcast, head to zeroeyes.com/Nobel, where you can see show notes, read more about our guests, and suggest guests or topics of your own. Until next time, stay in the fight. Don't ring the bell.